The United States just declared war on corporate home ownership, and Canada's about to feel the shockwave. Within hours of the announcement, housing stocks plummeted 5 to 10%, wiping out billions in market value. But here's what nobody's talking about. That money didn't vanish. It's moving north, and it's coming fast. Canadian home sales are already down more than 10% year over year. Prices are sliding in real terms. Buyers are frozen, and now the country faces something unprecedented. The same institutional capital that treated American neighborhoods like inventory is hunting for its next market. Canada just became the most obvious target. Wall Street spent years perfecting a simple formula: buy single-family homes in bulk, convert them to rentals, extract steady cash flow, refinance, repeat. The largest players accumulated over 700,000 homes combined. That entire business model depended on one thing: access. The moment Washington threatened to cut off that pipeline, capital started scanning for alternatives. They found one: your neighborhood. Canada already has a massive investor problem compared to the United States. Nearly 30% of home purchases involve investors. In the U.S., that number sits between 1 and 3%. In Ontario and British Columbia, investors own 30 to 40% of all condos. In some cities, they dominate new construction entirely before regular buyers even see a listing. So when American institutional money gets blocked at the border, even a modest shift into Canada becomes overwhelming. This matters because of how exposed Canada already is. 40% of Canadians report serious housing stress, worrying daily about affording rent or mortgage payments. Sales are collapsing. Inventory is climbing in multiple regions. Buyers can't qualify for mortgages at current rates, and sellers refuse to drop prices enough to clear the market. The system is locked. Then institutional capital shows up with cash offers, no financing conditions, and bulk purchase capabilities. Prices don't stabilize in that environment, they distort. What makes this dangerous is timing. Canada is sitting on a countdown clock that institutional investors are watching closely. Ottawa's foreign buyer ban expires January 1st, 2027. That single date transformed Canadian housing into a speculation trade. Institutional money doesn't wait for laws to expire. They position years ahead. Capital prices future access long before rules change, and every signal from Ottawa feeds that calculation. American institutional investors are now facing a wall at home while Canada advertises a reopening window. One country slams the door shut. The other leaves it cracked open with a visible timer. The result won't be gradual, it's front-loaded. Capital rushes in early, locks down positions, and by the time Canadian families realize what's happening, prices have already moved beyond reach. But Canada's vulnerability runs deeper than most people understand. Investors here don't just compete in the resale market, they're embedded in the supply chain itself. In many Canadian cities, institutional buyers purchase directly from builders before homes ever hit public listings. In Ontario alone, investors account for nearly 1/3 of all purchases. In some new developments, they control the majority of units before construction finishes. Construction financing costs have tripled in 18 months, so builders want guaranteed buyers. Institutional funds offer exactly that: cash certainty, fast closings, bulk contracts. That pushes builders to prioritize investor deals over individual buyers. Families aren't losing bidding wars anymore. They're being excluded before the competition even starts. When redirected American capital enters this system, it doesn't create more housing supply for Canadians. It monetizes scarcity. The math behind Canada's housing crisis is brutal and getting worse. Since 2020, average home prices jumped more than 30% while wages barely moved. Mortgage payments on new purchases are 40 to 60% higher than before the pandemic, even after recent rate cuts. Buyers aren't being cautious. They're locked out by numbers that simply don't work anymore. Then there's the mortgage renewal crisis nobody's prepared for. Over 1.2 million Canadian homeowners are renewing mortgages in 2025 and 2026. 85% of them locked in pandemic-era rates between 1 and 2%. Payment increases will average 15 to 20%. Some will jump 40%. A homeowner currently paying $26.50 monthly could suddenly owe $31.50. That's an extra $6,000 annually, and mortgage delinquencies are already spiking across the country. In Ontario, 90-plus day delinquencies jumped 90% year over year. When homeowners hit payment shock at exactly the moment cash-heavy institutional buyers flood the market, forced sales accelerate. Families lose homes to foreclosure. Investors purchase at distressed prices. The ownership gap widens permanently. Canada also just implemented new mortgage regulations that make this situation even worse for regular buyers. Starting January 2026, any mortgage relying on more than 50% rental income gets classified as higher risk. That means bigger down payments, stricter approvals, higher rates. The regulation effectively blocks small investors, the mom and pop landlords who traditionally competed with institutional money. Meanwhile, large institutional players don't need mortgages. They buy with pooled capital. No qualifications required. So Ottawa claims these rules will cool investor demand, but they're actually consolidating the market into fewer, bigger hands. The regulations eliminate competition at the bottom while leaving the top completely untouched. When American institutional capital arrives in this newly concentrated environment, there's even less resistance than before. The new rules didn't level the playing field. They tilted it further toward exactly the kind of institutional dominance Canada claims to be fighting, and the consequences are already visible in rental markets across the country. Canada's rental situation is precarious even without additional investor pressure. Average rents have been climbing at roughly 8% annually. More than 1 in 5 households now spends over 30% of their income just on shelter. Vacancy rates in major cities sit near historic lows, leaving renters with zero negotiating power. When new institutional demand enters that environment, rents don't rise steadily. They spike. Tenants have nowhere else to go, so they pay whatever the market demands. That creates a feedback loop that's nearly impossible to break. Higher rents make saving for a down payment harder, which keeps renters renting longer. Longer rental periods boost investor returns, which attracts even more capital into the market. What started as a housing policy shift in the United States quickly transforms into a cost of living crisis in Canada, hitting renters first and hardest. The damage spreads before any law officially changes in Ottawa. The pressure lands heaviest on first-time buyers. They face strict qualification rules, job uncertainty, and rising living costs while competing against institutions that buy with cash, bypass stress tests entirely, and operate on decades-long timelines. In Ontario, investors have already replaced first-time buyers as the largest purchasing group, nearly doubling their market share over the last decade. A new wave of capital only accelerates that displacement. Young Canadians delay moving out. They delay relationships. They delay starting families. Multi-generational living expands. Shared rentals increase. Mobility collapses. Housing stops being a milestone and becomes a permanent barrier. When that happens at scale, the damage isn't cyclical, it's generational. Research shows that belief in home ownership strongly shapes financial behavior. Renters who still hope to buy tend to save more, spend carefully, and work harder toward that goal. But when ownership feels permanently out of reach, behavior shifts. Spending patterns change, long-term planning disappears. People who give up on home ownership often remain financially hand-to-mouth for most of their lives, making it exponentially harder for future generations as well. Canada's supply problem makes everything worse. The country already builds far fewer homes per capita than peer nations and faces a shortfall estimated at millions of units by 2030. Permitting delays stretch on for years. Construction costs keep climbing. Labor shortages slow every project. Builders delay launches. Smaller developers exit the market entirely. New supply arrives slower every year. So when new demand arrives, especially institutional demand backed by billions in capital, prices rise long before any new homes appear. Families feel the squeeze first, renters feel it next. Affordability breaks again from the bottom up. Here's what makes this moment especially dangerous. Supply can't respond fast enough to absorb the shock. Even if Ottawa announced major construction initiatives tomorrow, those homes wouldn't hit the market for years. Planning approvals take months, Construction takes longer. Institutional buyers, by contrast, move in weeks. They identify targets, secure financing, and close deals before individual buyers even know properties are available. That speed advantage matters more now than ever. With the American market closing to institutional capital, funds are actively repositioning. They're analyzing Canadian markets, modeling returns, and preparing deployment strategies. By the time most Canadians recognize what's happening, institutional players will have already secured prime assets across multiple cities. The policy response from Ottawa has been almost comically inadequate. Housing Minister Mark Carney's headline, promised to double housing construction to 500,000 homes, annually collapses under any serious examination. The federal agency he proposed doesn't build homes, it doesn't own homes, it doesn't reserve homes for Canadians, it only finances private developers who immediately sell on the open market with zero protection against institutional buyers acquiring them. Independent analysis shows the plan would add roughly 26,000 units over 5 years. That's barely a 2% increase in a country that needs millions of homes just to restore basic affordability. That's not a solution. It's a press release disguised as policy. Worse, it leaves the door completely open for redirected American capital to purchase the very homes Ottawa claims it's trying to make affordable. The policy pretends to increase supply while quietly preserving the investor pipeline that's causing the problem in the first place. One country is attacking institutional dominance directly. The other is subsidizing construction without controlling who ends up owning the finished product. In a market already distorted by investor demand, that gap becomes an open invitation. Capital reads the signal loud and clear. Canada doesn't risk falling behind. It risks becoming the overflow valve for a housing model the United States just decided to shut down. And once that capital embeds itself in Canadian markets, extracting it becomes nearly impossible. The question isn't whether institutional money will flow north. It's already moving. The rental market reveals the true endgame. Canada already sits in a precarious position with average rents climbing 8% year over year. More than 1 in 5 households now spends over 30% of their income just on shelter. Vacancy rates in major cities hover near historic lows, leaving renters with virtually no negotiating power. When fresh institutional demand enters this already strained environment, rents don't creep upward gradually. They spike because tenants have nowhere else to turn. Higher rents create a vicious trap. Saving for a down payment becomes harder. Renters stay locked in rental units longer. That extended rental period boosts investor returns even further, attracting additional capital into the market. It becomes a self-reinforcing cycle. Once it gains momentum, unwinding it proves extraordinarily difficult. What started as a housing policy shift in the United States rapidly transforms into a cost of living crisis in Canada, hitting renters first and hardest, long before any new legislation passes in Ottawa. There's another explosive factor most Canadians haven't recognized yet. Over 1.2 million homeowners are renewing mortgages in 2025 and 2026. 85% of them locked into pandemic-era rates between 1 and 2%. Payment increases will average 15 to 20%. Some will jump 40%. A homeowner currently paying $26.50 monthly could suddenly owe $31.50 every single month. That's an extra $6,000 annually that wasn't budgeted. Mortgage delinquencies are already climbing. In Ontario, 90-plus day delinquencies jumped 90% year over year. When homeowners facing payment shock meet cash-heavy institutional buyers, forced sales accelerate rapidly. Families lose homes to foreclosure. Investors acquire properties at distressed prices. The ownership gap widens permanently. This isn't a hypothetical future scenario. It's happening right now across multiple provinces. The structural transformation extends beyond individual transactions. Starting in January 2026, new mortgage regulations from the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions fundamentally changed who can buy investment properties in Canada. Any mortgage relying on more than 50% of rental income for qualification now gets classified as higher risk, requiring bigger down payments, stricter approvals, and elevated interest rates. This rule effectively blocks small investors from building rental portfolios. The mom-and-pop landlords who traditionally competed with institutional money get pushed out entirely. The result is predictable, but brutal. Small-scale investors exit the market while institutional players with massive cash reserves step in to fill the void. They don't need mortgages. They buy with pooled capital. No qualification requirements apply. Ottawa claims these rules will cool investor demand. In reality, they're consolidating the market into fewer, bigger hands. The regulations eliminate competition at the bottom while leaving the top completely untouched. When American institutional capital arrives in this newly concentrated environment, there's even less resistance. The new rules didn't level the playing field. They tilted it further toward exactly the kind of institutional dominance Canada claims to be fighting. Young Canadians are responding by fundamentally altering life plans. They delay moving out, they delay relationships, they delay starting families. Multi-generational living expands, shared rentals increase, economic mobility collapses, housing stops being a milestone and transforms into a permanent barrier. When that happens at scale, the damage isn't cyclical, it's generational. Wealth inequality deepens across entire demographics, creating cascading effects that will take decades to reverse. The choice facing Canada is stark. Either Ottawa implements immediate restrictions on institutional ownership of residential properties, or the market makes that decision for them. The American ban demonstrates that political action is possible when pressure builds sufficiently, but Canada's window for meaningful intervention is closing rapidly. Capital moves faster than legislation. By the time Parliament debates solutions, institutional buyers will have already secured prime assets across multiple cities. Every week of inaction compounds the problem. Every delayed policy discussion gives institutional capital more time to embed itself deeper into Canadian housing markets. Once that capital establishes positions, extracting it becomes exponentially harder. Properties don't return to individual ownership easily. Institutional portfolios are built to hold for decades, extracting rental income continuously while appreciating in value. The question isn't whether this creates long-term consequences. It absolutely does. The question is whether Canadians will tolerate watching homeownership transform from an achievable goal into an exclusive privilege reserved for those already wealthy enough to compete with billion-dollar funds. Because that's the trajectory. That's where current policies lead without aggressive intervention. One country just decided institutional dominance of housing markets had gone too far. The other is about to discover what happens when you become the release valve for capital that's been told it's no longer welcome elsewhere. Canada faces a binary choice that can't be postponed much longer. Either implement direct restrictions on institutional residential ownership immediately, or watch homeownership become a historical artifact for everyone except the already wealthy. The American decision proves political action is viable when pressure reaches critical mass. But Canada's intervention window is shrinking by the day. Capital doesn't wait for legislative debates. Institutional buyers are modeling Canadian markets right now, allocating resources, preparing deployment strategies. By the time Ottawa finishes committee hearings, prime assets across Toronto, Vancouver, Calgary, and Montreal will already be locked into institutional portfolios designed to hold for decades. The trajectory is clear. Without aggressive policy intervention, Canadian housing transitions from an achievable milestone into an exclusive privilege. First-time buyers get replaced by permanent renters. Families competing against billion-dollar funds lose before the bidding even starts. The ownership gap that's already widening becomes permanent, locking multiple generations into rental markets with no exit path. One country just declared that institutional dominance of housing had crossed an unacceptable line. The other is about to become the overflow destination for that same capital. The United States said no. Canada's answer will determine whether home ownership survives as anything more than a memory for the next generation.